All right, welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Say hello to some folks. Good morning. Good morning. What's up, Hiram? Uh, JMP and Chitty Macho. Welcome, welcome. Definitely make sure to, do the basic things and like the video, subscribe to our channel if you're not, share, with your friends and your comrades. And we're going to be doing a study group on the manual we'll be talking about today, the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And so there's a link to that in the chat. It will be through our Patreon, which you can join for as little as $1 a month. If you're not able to afford that and still want to join, there's a way you can do that is just reach out to me and I'll set that up. But importantly, our guest today is one of my favorite folks to talk to, genuinely. I'm not going to do a long-winded introduction because that probably would require me to say a bunch of things that he wouldn't want to say about his employer and all those other things. And so I'll just say that I'm really grateful. Dylan Rodríguez is a brilliant insurgent scholar, activist, and somebody who thinks really deeply and I think consistently and rigorously about counterinsurgency. And that's what we want to talk about today. And one of the things he's always encouraged me to do, others to do in a lot of his talks is to read the Counterinsurgency Field Manual and get together with friends and comrades and study it and break it down and think about it, in collective ways with radical folks. And so hopefully today we'll get to kind of model a little bit of that, and then we'll build on that going forward. So Dylan Rodríguez, welcome to the show. It's great to have you back.
I know, love this. I love the fact that you're doing this project, and I appreciate anybody that's coming through today. So can't wait for this to unfold this conversation with you, Jared. You know I always love this shit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I don't know if we'll probably be here for about an hour and a half, and I know we have a ton to cover, so I think we'll kind of jump into it. So one of the things that I did, I know you did, is we kind of revisited some of these various documents. The primary one that we'll talk about, I'm going to just pull my screen up and show folks what it is. So this is Joint Publication 324, Counterinsurgency. It's the April of 2018 version. I don't know what validated in 2021 means, but and I guess something about the history of this a little bit that we should say up front is that initially it was an Army and Marine Corps publication. I have to go back, but I believe in 2007, I want to say, is at the end of the year.
So it was they started the collaboration like right around 2005, 2006. And it was like, if you look at the history of this 21st century version of the Counterinsurgency Manual, it was highly unusual as a kind of U.S. military doctrine because it was the writing and publication was so accelerated, and the collaborative nature of it between the Army and Marines was also relatively unusual. In this case, but yeah, it was like that 05 to 07 period. And then I think it was published, I think it was first published 06, 07.
I think there was a draft version. And then they actually went through a process of bringing in media.
That's right.
And talking to them about it. I mean, there's a fascinating thing from that University of Chicago version where they talk about the Atlantic, and the Atlantic talking about how it was like the best, most open process. And so, folks, we've seen a lot of the Atlantic's counterinsurgent articles and publications since October 7th. And I think that, we can see that, I mean, obviously there's also the relationship of their editor-in-chief to the Israeli occupation forces, and he was actually a prison guard. But there's also this collaboration around these things.
And Jared, you're talking about the collaborations and the kind of the consultations that the military was doing in the lead up to this version of it, right? So adding to that, it was kind of liberal corporate media types, liberal journalist types. Importantly, they also brought in human rights officials and attorneys and like intellectual types. They brought them in. They brought in people that are like that are organic part and parcel of the human rights establishment, which should, I think, challenge everybody to rethink their political, analytical, and rhetorical dependence on the human rights apparatus and the human rights language when they're trying to challenge nearby to global systems of domination, violence, genocide, anti-Black oppression, coloniality, etc. And another central part of their consultation were academics. And I'm not talking the kind of typical, Cold War era area studies, CIA type academics, by which I mean people that are both funded by the CIA and people whose work was used by the CIA and its analogs. But I'm talking about, they brought in humanities scholars, interdisciplinary scholars, as part of, I believe it was a 2-day consultation in the lead up to publishing this document. So we need to understand, as Jared and I were talking right before we started the show, that this document is in many ways, the process of creating this counterinsurgency field manual was in many ways more interdisciplinary than a lot of academics work who call themselves interdisciplinary. So I think that's crucial. I'm glad that you're spending a little bit of time just setting this thing up, because this did not just come from the desk of, Petraeus and Mattis. This was very much a collaborative document that pulled from people in so-called civil society.
Yeah, and I think we'll see as we go through it, like some of those influences and some of that thinking too. I mean, we're not going to obviously go through the whole thing today. We're going to go through part of the executive summary. This is the preface. One of the things I find fascinating, and this is just on a basic level, but this is doctrine, right? And Kilcullen, who's this guy who was one of the key participants in kind of writing this and implementing it, and then wrote another book called Counterinsurgency, which sort of talks about like how he thinks it should be implemented. And he's a fascinating figure. He's an Australian military person, did his field work as kind of anthropology plus being involved in the armed forces in doing counterinsurgency in Indonesia. And he talks about how Australia is interesting because it's always joint ventures. Like Australia doesn't lead military operations, usually doesn't have a large enough military, but it's always doing counterinsurgency work, basically. And so he's just an interesting figure in terms of also that nexus of academia, of this counterinsurgency doctrine, et cetera. So, and he talks about how it sets forth doctrine, but similar to how people might critique like doctrinaire Marxists, right? Kilcullen says like the best people at implementing this are very adaptive. They take into account local conditions, local circumstances, and they try to kind of, address those. And so I just wanted to say that up front.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important clarification, I think, because the notion of doctrine, especially military doctrine, can in some ways be very misleading, because the way I think it's taken is to suggest that it's referencing a relatively stable, established, if not static, paradigm and method of warfare. And I think what you see immediately when you read the counterinsurgency field manual is that this is very much not the type of doctrine that the manual represents, because there are so many moments in which counterinsurgency, in fact, counterinsurgency is permanently and necessarily experimental, and in certain historical moments is conjunctural. But by which what we're talking about, of course, is the kind of confluence of significant, global, if not regional, economic, political, cultural, and insurgent forces. So I think that's part of the reason why the field manual was revised and basically overhauled after 20 years of having not been it hadn't been published basically since 1986. So it's in the midst of the full unfolding of the so-called war on terror, the perpetual, ongoing, never-ending war on terror, that this so-called doctrine undergoes this kind of massive, like we talked about, interdisciplinary, collaborative rethinking as a permanent state of military experimentation with very different sets of guiding strategic principles in most ways than previous iterations of counterinsurgency. And of course, like what I'm hoping I know what we'll talk about later, but as we get into this, I'm really interested in particular about how this conceptualization of counterinsurgency has found its way into kind of occupying the political imagination and the, everyday work, scholarly work, tactical mobilization work of so-called domestic or U.S.-based or even just North American so-called social justice movements. That's what interests me here is how the interdisciplinary production of a military field manual actually prefaces, it anticipates this kind of metastasizing of counterinsurgency as a political logic that then comes to constitute social justice organizing, especially first, kind of global North and North American and U.S.-based social justice organizing.
And I think that's a very important thing to say up front, because I think one thing, this came up actually as I mentioned this in our we just finished the Sylvia Winter study group and mentioned that we were going to be doing this today. And somebody brought up, well, this doctrine hasn't worked. So why do you think it, and it's true in some respect, right? I mean, you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, the counterinsurgency did not ultimately, achieve its objectives in those environments. And, but I think part of what necessitated it nonetheless was that what they were doing before this was even less effective, because they recognized, as we'll get into, that in counterinsurgency, the key is the population. It's not actually so much about the combatants as it is about trying to turn the population against the insurgents, and to bring them back into the fold of what they call the home nation. But really what that means is Western hegemony, so anyways, let's get into a little bit of it here.
Well, no, just on that point, there's at least two ways to think about the failure that you just outlined, which I'm affirming that, right? So you look at the so-called counterinsurgency doctrine of the U.S. and other militaries, and you look at all of its various failures. Most famously starting in Vietnam, but actually from my understanding of it, the history of it, one of the points of origin for counterinsurgency in the modern sense that we understand the term is actually the U.S. occupation of the Philippines. Started around 1899, 1900. And if you look at that, right? So I mean, you could look at that, right? That occupation and kind of colonial project also failed, right? It never neutralized the insurgencies that are still ongoing to this day. At this point, the insurgencies are not merely against U.S. militarism occupations, also against the Philippine nation state. So there's at least a couple ways to see that. One is that in the kind of contemporary iterations of both neoliberal racial capitalism and the U.S. and kind of conglomerated military-industrial apparatus, that the kind of failure to reach a definitive close with counterinsurgency operations is baked into that apparatus. In other words, it actually reproduces the kind of networks and circuits, multiple circuits, and sometimes these circuits are contradictory to each other, but they compose a general coherent whole. And what they reproduce is precisely this kind of asymmetric militarism, the asymmetric extraction, these kind of advancing, accumulating, expansivist logics of racial capitalism, and it's kind of, in a sense, it's dying phases, but it's going to stay in its dying phases for as long as it possibly can. So on the one hand, there's that, right? The perpetuality of the failure is baked into the logic of the apparatus. And then the other part of this too, that is really important that we pay very close attention to if we're going to be serious in studying counterinsurgency strategies and curricula, is that, this manual and its precedents fully concede the possibility, if not the likelihood, that the insurgencies that they're confronting are very hard to neutralize. You feel me? So it's like, it's what strikes you about this particular literature is that both conceptually and rhetorically, there's a real sense that they know that they're facing a fucking beast.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Vietnam, they're like these little rat-like motherfuckers are hard to kill. Like, that's basically what these fuckers are saying. You know, like they're saying in this kind of sanitized military type language, but it's not very sanitized if you're serious, you know. But that's basically what they're saying. It's like these insurgencies are constant, they're ongoing, they're really hard to figure out, and we're going to do our best. And you know, we may not make it, but here's a kind of framework to continue that work.
And I think one of the things that's important to say too is, as you alluded to prior to this, I think it's much more effective domestically because it's harder to really see it and understand it as what it is. When, you know, it's easier for people in Afghanistan and in Iraq, or people in Palestine, to recognize the counterinsurgency, to recognize the war that's being waged against them and who's waging it. Right. Whereas in the United States, because, you know, it's more challenging, right? And this, you know, we could get into discussions of neocolonialism and city politics and all that, and we probably will at some point. But like, you know, I think that there's certainly dangers that it's much more effective, I think, in a domestic terrain, even though it's tested out and really created as doctrine through these colonizing and imperialist projects around the world, for sure. All right, so I'm just gonna like read a few highlighted portions, you know, so just so people understand. And this section really just kind of lays out a lot of the terms. So, you know, insurgency is the organized use of subversion and violence to seize, nullify, or challenge political control of a region. You know, it's an interstate conflict within state, right? And, you know, what's interesting is obviously, you know, they recognize, like you said, how common these are, you know, that it involves in this army doctrine, right? It involves the U.S. being requested in by a partner nation, or basically it says when the U.S. overthrows somebody else's government and has to decide how to try to reestablish a new government, you know, and so it's quite open that that's one of the sort of theaters for this. Yeah, I mean, this part was fascinating to me in terms of its explicit call of globalization, weak nation state governments, changing demographics and radical ideologies, environmental changes and economic pressures. I mean, that just sounds like a conservative, like Fox News, like, you know, of like, these are the conditions that create these challenges, you know.
It also raises this kind of intro overview in the manual. It raises immediate questions, I think, for a lot of people who are both engaged in and necessarily also critical of the movement's organizations they participate in. It raises questions about how the activities of social justice oriented organizations and campaigns within a kind of nonprofit context, the university and academic context, etc., serve as a form of intelligence gathering. You know, and this is essential to the way that the field manual frames the work of counterinsurgency. I mean, even in the classical sense, intelligence gathering has always been important, but I think in this 21st century iteration of counterinsurgency, the notion of intelligence gathering in this executive summary is tied to the imperative to figure out what I believe the manual refers to as the so-called operational design, the operational design of insurgencies, or in this case, social movements, or you know, left insurrections and insurgencies within the United States, and other kind of first world global north nation states. So that's part of this too, right? So I think I'm hoping that as we do this form of study with each other, that folks can kind of understand that some of the frameworks that are being articulated by the Army and by the Army and the Marine Corps here, we need to take these as both on their own terms, like take it within the limitations and the purposes of the counterinsurgency field manual, but also read it as a literature. You know, read it as a kind of like as a form of like state pedagogy, and also as a state extraction from what it has, I think, pulled from understanding how the kind of liberal reformism of so-called left movements in places like the United States actually serve counterinsurgency political logics, right? They replicate, or they kind of serve the purposes of counterinsurgency political logic, right? So I'm not saying it's this kind of conspiratorial thing. I'm saying it's actually the state reflecting its study, right?
Yeah.
The state reflecting its own capacity to study left and liberal movements and organizations, especially within the nonprofit industrial complex and the academic university apparatus.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think within like the nonprofit world, as well as within the university, like a lot of these logics are so embedded now that people don't, it's not like they have to study counterinsurgency to be a part of it. It just, is a part of their operating, principles in a lot of ways. And the things that they're taught are best practices and so on,
Yeah. So I mean, I think for me, like, if there's one takeaway point from our conversation, it's to reframe counterinsurgency as a political logic, right? That, like, let's read against the framing of counterinsurgency as a kind of like as a typical military strategic curriculum, which of course it is. Of course it's that. But I'm saying we need to reread counterinsurgency, in particular things like this field manual, as the articulation of a political logic that's probably already in motion. Well, it's definitely already in motion, in which, I keep using the term, it's mobilized, it's metastasized to the point where I think that it's become an MO, right? It's actually just a modus operandi. It's kind of a best practices apparatus for established forms of political organizing among people who identify themselves or ourselves as social justice oriented, left oriented, or even, abolitionists, anti-colonialists, and revolutionary, all that shit. That's the point. The point is to understand this is a political logic. We need to find better ways, better analytical frameworks, better kind of forms of critical collective study that are also practical critical forms of collective study that identify this political logic within the shift that we're doing.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, obviously in this paragraph here at the top where it talks about, the necessity within counterinsurgency to integrate and synchronize political, security, legal, economic, development, and psychological activities carried out by the host nation and applicable United States government and multinational partners. And again, and to create a holistic approach, right, aimed at weakening the insurgents while simultaneously bolstering the government's legitimacy in the eyes of the contested population. I think that paragraph is really critical too, because it touches on all the different registers that they're consciously thinking about. And so it ought to, I think, tip us that when we start seeing these new economic development programs come out, when you start to see, the rollout of different kind of reform initiatives that target small business owners, when you start to see, and the psychological aspect of it. I mean, they're quite clear in this manual that one, that counterinsurgency is war, and that two, that it operates across all of these different registers, and
yeah. I mean, you're right. Just that paragraph, that sentence, I think, can provide a really helpful framework for rethinking the premises of some of the internal debates and arguments that a lot of us have within our movements and organizations around the issue of what people generally call engaging the state, right? Which means, it usually means, okay, do we get involved in electoral politics? Do we support this particular candidate? Do the grassroots? Do we run a particular candidate for this particular position in this particular office? Do we fuck with state institutions to try to do what I would call casualty management? Others would call reforms or non-reformist reforms or whatever. But that paragraph, I think, brings a different kind of bottom line into the conversation, which is that last phrase, right? Bolstering government, I'm gonna call it the state, bolstering the state's legitimacy. But I'll rephrase it as bolstering the legitimacy of the state and state power. If we can ask ourselves that question in the different types of work we do, I think we can at least be more honest about the limitations of what we're doing, right? So like, I'll say this to folks that are watching, listening, and thinking about this. If I'm doing work within the capacities of the institution that employs me, like, I'm under no illusions that that's going to be somehow like the cutting edge or leading edge of a radical or revolutionary insurgency, right? Like, it's at best casualty management, and at worst it's liberalism that's going to reproduce dominant oppressive power, right? But at least I understand I'm not going to misrepresent it to people as being other than that, right? Like, on the other hand, there's forms of work that I think people can more collectively commit to, that we can identify as contributing to undermining or decentering, or at least questioning the legitimacy of government, state, and state, of the government, the state, and state power. But that's a kind of, but this is the problem, is I think that within a lot of left social justice movements, there's a kind of shared delusion, and sometimes just maybe like an earnestly ignorant political dishonesty, that the shit that we're devoting so much energy to is actually contributing to relegitimating the very same state that we are so radically critical of, right? And we can give examples all day, but I think it's not ironic. I think it's completely logical that the U.S. military Joint Chiefs of Staff are providing a kind of analytical frame that can be extracted, right, and resituated to offer a critical analysis of the shit that we're doing, right? Like, are we actually playing into this political logic of like restoring the legitimacy of a genocidal anti-Black colonial state?
Yeah, and I think that's key. I mean, and I think the interesting thing, right, is that this manual sees it as key, right? They see that they're fighting over the population and and who the population gravitates towards in terms of whether it is a movement, and we'll get into how it characterizes insurgency and how it thinks about insurgency, because I think those are really fascinating, because it also basically says that, insurgent populations are groups that are attached to historical grievances, are seeking justice, and so it doesn't characterize insurgents as, obviously it uses terms like terrorism and violence throughout the document to some degree, but that's not how they actually understand insurgents. They understand insurgents that actually, in many cases, have a just cause and a weaker state, and a set of historical grievances that they're able to talk about. But their plot in this is to create a counter narrative that bolsters the legitimacy of the state. And so, it's interesting even here. Like, I was thinking about, and I should say, folks, like, this book, when Dylan brings up, discussions of the Philippines, and like, this book is all about this stuff, really. And so, but one of the things I remember we talked about in one of our conversations was hegemony, and like right here, you have this sentence which reminded me so much of, all governments govern through a combination of influence and to some degree coercion, right? Like, that's just sort of like Gramsci right there. So I think those are important things to think about, right? Is that we are, even thinking about our own movements, of how much are we contesting the legitimacy, right, of the state and of the government and of their ability to solve our problems, when we know that, the entire history of it is not that,
Yeah, I mean, that I think is really critical to this whole study that we're doing, is that I think we need to be honest about just disagreements we have, or not you and me. I mean, a lot of us that are engaged in this work, about disagreements we might have around that. But I mean, I think that there's a kind of false consensus that often sets up the conversations and arguments and debates within a particular set of people or organizations or people within a movement. There's this false consensus that, oh, well, we all agree that the state is the problem, right? And then, okay, now let's debate, like, how do we fuck with the state? How do we engage the state, et cetera? And what comes out very often in those debates and discussions is that we actually don't all agree that there's a fundamental problem with the state. In fact, there might be a pretty antagonistic, irreconcilable disagreement about the possibility that the apparatus of the state and the form of power that a state enacts can somehow be appropriated away from its what Dean Spade calls its fundamental extractiveness, and what many others refer to as its coloniality, anti-Blackness, and genocidal logics. I mean, in many ways, that's the logic of the nation state, versus those who are invested in trying to operationalize either a local or larger scaled version of the state that can somehow service the people, right? And I'm saying, like, that's a disagreement. And it's probably not a reconcilable one, but it's one that needs to be hashed out. It just needs, and I think it needs to be done so in a much more honest way that is not kind of dislocated by a false consensus that we all think about the state being a problem in the same way. Right. Like a lot of this shit ends up being looped back into militant efforts that use radical language where the objective is essentially to either counter-occupy or reform the state. That's a project. And like, I can't lie, like I participate in those projects all the fucking time, right? But I can also say that they probably contradict where I believe my politics have moved over these years, which is, I think where my politics are situated is that I actually think that the state itself, in its kind of the imaginability of the state as a form and as a structure of power, I think that actually is the rudimentary part of the rudimentary problem. And I'm not sure that if it's hypothetically possible to push a state and state power beyond and against its own kind of foundational logics of extractiveness, genocidality, coloniality, anti-blackness, etc. I'm not sure that that is a project that I'm willing to invest my energy in when there are other kinds of political projects that might contribute to the kind of intended radical obsolescence of the state. And of course, that's exactly what counterinsurgency is trying to stop. Right. So something we can touch on maybe later is how the reaction against the federal reaction against the Stop Cop City movement has and I owe this discussion to William Anderson, Dean Spade, Harsha Walia. We're in a little study group together. But the three I've learned so much from the three of them. But part of what William has been talking about, and we wrote an article about this recently, is how the figure of the anarchist, the rubric of anarchism, plays this role historically, but especially in that moment, the Stop Cop City moment, to kind of stamp out, to repress any capacity, any inclination to question the legitimacy of state power. So I think we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another question that or another disagreement probably, which might be where I fall in somewhere in this, is like that there may be some of us who still have some investment in the idea of a state and the possibilities of a state, but not this state, right? And so then we're not interested in rehabilitating or re-legitimizing, this state. And so that I realize those are three separate trajectories, but I think that they're all there and they all exist within our movements, Sure.
Yes. I'm just tired of collaborate. I've always had to fucking collaborate with the Democratic Party, y'all.
Yeah.
I'm tired of it. Like, I'm just, oh my God, I'm so exhausted by arguing with people about fucking with the Democratic Party and running somebody under the rubric of Democratic or supporting. It's like, in some ways that's kind of like an immediate bottom line. But like, I can't believe how many people who I deeply, deeply intellectually and politically respect, I'm constantly arguing with about like whether we should be putting our energy into shit that is directly under the authority of the Democratic Party. Sorry, it's like, it's not a side comment. Actually, it's pretty central to what we're talking about.
No, it is absolutely. Yeah. No, I don't think there's a more insurgent entity in the United States of America than the Democratic Party, probably. So, all right. So let's see, going on here. There's some pieces. So I wanted to bring up this little section on the nature of insurgency because I found this really interesting. So insurgent groups tend to adopt an irregular approach because they lack the resources required to directly confront the incumbent government in traditional warfare. Over time, insurgencies work to force governments to the negotiating table or to grow until insurgent forces can directly confront and defeat the government security forces and seize control over the seat of government. Insurgencies are driven by commercial or insurgencies driven by commercial or criminal objectives are an exception. Rather, they focus on gaining political control of the country's leaders and security apparatus. I found that fascinating because there's nothing in that paragraph or that little section that I like disagree with at all in terms of things that are good. I mean, it's like, I mean, basically they're just saying like an insurgency seeks, to negotiate for its grievances or reforms, or possibly if their reforms are not met to, enact a new state or a new government, and I think that's, like in some ways, I guess what you could say is that if that's the nature of insurgency, then pretty much any social movement worth its salt would be characterized as an insurgency by a doctrine like this.
Yeah, you would hope that like to be categorized as an insurgent would be an aspiration, which is I mean, in most ways it's parallel. If you take that phrase irregular approach, what they're talking about is what folks now call terrorism, with a kind of pejorative, usually Islamophobic or anti-Black attachment to it. But in the kind of classical military concept, without kind of value shit being invested in it, the notion of terrorism, right? That's part of an asymmetric approach. That's part of a so-called irregular approach, right? So what this also names is that what makes insurgent groups insurgent is that they're willing to make use of irregular approaches, asymmetric approaches, because they're in positions of conventional military weakness relative, to people who have tanks and bombs and that kind of thing.
Right.
But that's a distinction. I think that the kind of the dominant stream of social justice oriented people in North America and the United States are absolutely disidentifying against an insurgent position, right? It's not only that folks don't want to undertake irregular approaches themselves, right? Which is fine. Like, I get that. We all have different capacities. Like, I think I would be a fucking liability if I tried to do certain irregular things. You know what I mean? But in addition to that folks are not willing to support them. Right. So like, I just don't want to get that twisted, but I want to say that like that the kind of, when I say the disavowing and identification against insurgency, I'm talking about folks in social justice circles who are against it. Right. And they will disavow it. They will condemn it, et cetera. And you saw it happening right after October 7th. Right after October 7th, you saw this kind of mandatory, compulsory, almost in many cases a voluntary thing where you have to condemn a particular form of irregular military action before you can articulate a critique of a quickly unfolding genocidal state.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to spend long on this, but they talk about conditions for insurgency or opportunity, motive, and means. It's interesting in some respects, but like, I mean, basically it's just sort of, that's kind of basic. This was interesting too. I mean, they note quite openly that the objectives of insurgents are, basically to force the government to succumb to pressure over time, and to negotiate favorably, and so I mean, again, like, we're not actually talking about something here that, I mean, I think in any of us who have been involved or have been close to different social movements over the years, that's usually the goal, is to, either get the state is ideally to get the state to meet your needs, right? That's often, so I just think that's an interesting thing too, again.
This is important. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Jared.
Well, I just want to also bring into this section, I mean, we can talk about it next. Maybe we should answer that first, but narrative and strategy, I think, is fascinating within this, and it connects with your work, it connects with Winter's work. And so, I don't know if you want to go there, if you wanted to say something about that.
Well, just real quick on this point. I think this is something that's lurking just beyond the scope of the field manual, of the counterinsurgency field manual. It's this thing around the negotiation with the state. Right. So the field manual is correct, which is that in many instances, the whole point of an insurgency is to basically to leverage pressure against a dominant state, to force them to make certain rudimentary fundamental concessions. In other cases, not even that. It's to actually replace or overthrow that state. But if we stick with that notion of pushing a kind of a militant undertaking that creates massive leverage to force the state into a negotiation it otherwise would not have, that leads into yet another field of counterinsurgency that is not addressed by this manual, and that is the field of negotiation with the state, right? What happens when people actually are able to pressure and leverage the state into, opening the conference room door, inviting us to y'all motherfuckers in, right? And now you're going to be in there with some bureaucrats, administrators, and executives, and they're going to, their hand is being forced, right? They're now forced to listen to you, and they might even be forced to actually involve people from your organization, your movement, your insurgency in a meaningful and operative negotiation. What happens then, right? And I'm not just talking about things like hostage negotiations. I'm talking about things, for example, like city budgets, right?
Yeah.
Like city budgets and how much should or should not be allotted to the police, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Right? And we need to learn from this, right? Because this is an unfolding real-time archive of this whole field of counterinsurgency that is happening all around us, which is what happens in the aftermath of the insurgency, right? When people who were the insurgents are invited into the negotiation with the state, who like have thought about this shit, are part of communities that are holding them accountable as they do this negotiation. I'm not talking about this in a cynical way, right? I'm talking about, I've learned this from people who participate in these things. But what they feed back to the rest of us are lessons about how these fields of state negotiation have come to constitute their own areas of counterinsurgent activity. And the technologies are a little bit different, right? Like something I've been saying every now and then is how what I've learned from the folks who talk about those negotiations with city councils around city budgets and policing in the aftermath of uprisings that are now talking about defunding and all this stuff. The state is really, I think, grindingly consistent in the ways that it is able to mobilize boredom. It is able to mobilize boredom, by which I mean busy work, bureaucratic jargon, all that shit that makes your eyes like roll up into your head and you start tearing up. Like it's actually it's like physiological, it's a psyop, right?
Yeah.
That boredom becomes its own technology of counterinsurgency within this new field, which is the leverage negotiation with the state that your movement has created. So there's like this thing that's just outside the military kind of concern, or in our case, the militarized policing concern, that I think we need to pay another thing, we need to pay very, very close analytical attention to that.
And I think it does come up maybe more in Till Cullen than in the manual itself. Yeah. But there is absolutely an implicit understanding. Part of the reason I think that they even set out that objective is to also help all of the counterinsurgents and all these different spheres come to terms with the fact that ultimately we need some level of negotiation with these folks, because that's their goal, and that's how we reestablish our legitimacy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Obviously, they want them, but I think an important thing to think about in all of this too, because I don't want to get too black and white on like things people should and shouldn't do, is that part of what has to always be considered is, do these processes, these struggles, these tactics and strategies we engage in, do they bring more of the population basically to the side of the insurgents in the way that this manual would look at it? Or does it do more work to legitimize the state, the government status quo? And I think that's an interesting thing, because they're attentive to that all the time. They don't want the insurgencies to gain more legitimacy, to gain more control. And that's part of the thing that they talk about as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is what's important about this revision of the manual is that, and I know we're about to jump into this notion, kind of centering this notion of narrative, right? If you read some of the keywords here, like things like the population, right? The notion of the population is not necessarily easily identified in this piece of literature, right? It's not readily evident what this manual means by the population. And by that I mean both the scale that is talking about the population. Is it talking about the village? Is it talking about the region? Is it talking about the nation? You know what I'm saying? And then on the other hand, it's not entirely evident whether what the insurgents mean, or the way that the insurgents are touching and reaching and winning the population or the people or whatever. It's not entirely evident, at what scale or in what context and under what notion of population that insurgent victory is meaningful, that is in delegitimizing the occupying state.
Yeah.
And so like, again, we translate this into other contexts. And I know that we can identify how in different geographies that we do our political work in, you might be able, I'm saying if you're involved in what we would loosely call insurgent activity, that is activity trying to delegitimate the institution that you are struggling against, not just win reforms from it, but delegitimate it. You might not actually need to win the majority. You know what I'm saying? The majority of that particular geography's population. You might just win a really hardcore minor block of that population. Yep. And that's sufficient to, at least for a moment, to create an irreconcilable and incorrigible opponent to that institution and institutional power.
Yeah, I mean, and some of it is about like creating enough space and security for your movement and vice versa, and so, yeah, it can be, I mean, Kilcullen does get into that more in his book, but it can be very much like kind of block by block local. Like it doesn't have to be, obviously they're thinking about these forces on all different levels, but like it can be, when they talk about the population, it can literally be just like a neighborhood or a town or something like that, So, this part, I just think narratives, partly because we just read some Sylvia Wynter stuff. And so, her thinking about narrative, I think caused this to resonate with me more. But insurgent groups harness narratives to communicate grievances, goals, and justifications for actions to both internal and external audiences. Insurgency narratives have three elements or components: actors or environments in which they operate, events along a temporal continuum, and causality, cause and effect relative to the first two elements. They go on, of course, to talk more about like insurgents and the different ways that they might be organized, politically, militarily, also traditionally and cellularly. And that's interesting. We delve into that more as we studied it. But that part around narrative, I think, is so important. And one of the things that is, I haven't read this whole manual yet, so maybe it does get to it eventually, but I'm not sure it's really addressed in the manual. They talk about the importance of the counterinsurgency narrative, but they don't necessarily name what that narrative is here, because I think it's context specific. It's like based on what they're trying to combat, right? So it might be, in the hindsight or in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd, all of the work went into reestablishing, re-legitimizing police, re-legitimizing local governments, supporting politicians who were more and more pro-police than the next, and so we might think of that as an example of a counterinsurgency narrative, right? That just got blasted out everywhere that people would be very aware of, but I think that's, go ahead. Sorry.
No, well, Jared, can you pull out? I know this is always goofy, but could you? I don't know. Screen share another part. I know this past executive summary, but I was reading into this and kind of reviewing this and preparing our conversation. It's section 3-9.
Section 3-9 of this, yeah.
No. There's a section. I could just read it out loud too. It's a section called "Develop the Counterinsurgency Narrative." It's something I wanted to maybe read out loud also, to help develop this part of our discussion, because it just kind of shows how serious this kind of military effort is. It's page 69 of the document. I just found it, page 69 of the document. It's called develop the coin narrative. Develop these coin me. So y'all, when they capitalize coin, it just means counterinsurgency. You'll see, in case you ever see it in your reading. So there's that
page number weird for me.
Okay. Well, I'll just read it out loud. How about that?
Yeah, go ahead, read it if I find it helpful.
Okay, there's a section in the field manual. It's like, about a third of the way in. And there's a small section called develop the counterinsurgency narrative. And this is what I wanted us to pay attention to. Quote, fulfilling military objectives is only part of counterinsurgency. The key is to demonstrate to the relevant population that the home nation government and its allies are not only winning, but that their cause is just and irresistible. This is accomplished through the development of a counterinsurgency narrative to overwhelm the insurgency narrative. The counterinsurgency narrative should contextualize what the population experiences, legitimizing counterinsurgent actions and delegitimizing the insurgency. I mean, it's hard to imagine it being crystallized better in understanding what I think is in most ways the heart and soul of effective forms of counterinsurgency. And this is to say that that narrative is a form of warfare, right? That's I think another important takeaway point. Like, if we're going to read and study Winter seriously and take into account her whole counter and anti-civilizational critique, but it's a narrative. It's about civilization as this kind of it's a narrative warfare apparatus. Like, that's what it is. What the U.S. military is saying here is that narrative is a specific kind of overlapping field of warfare that is arguably as important, and in some cases more important, right, more significant and definitive than the site of military conflict or guerrilla conflict, and so forth and so on, right? So it's also important to be able to understand that this is a portable, translatable framework in thinking about how it is that social justice apparatuses, social justice movements have actually come to, maybe in some cases, I think fully intentionally, in other cases kind of just systemically and automatically, that they participate in developing their own counterinsurgency narratives against the very insurgencies that they come from, right? That it's about delegitimizing a particular arm of a movement, say, challenging anti-Black state violence, right? That part of the relegitimating counterinsurgent narrative is one that disavows particular forms of what we call irregular activity that are challenging state power, challenging the impunity of the state in generating these forms of anti-Black violence. So it's about disavowing, or at least containing and kind of pacifying those elements, domesticating those elements, in order to undertake other forms of more responsible, mature, and usually state-facing political work, right? In other cases, it's civil society-facing, but it's oftentimes, funded, right? If it's not funded by local government, it's funded by philanthropic organizations or a university or whatever. And, like, again, full transparency, I know this because I fuck around. I'm, like, involved in some of that shit, right? Sure. So, like, I'm not saying this from some kind of position of abstraction or rule. I'm saying, like, as somebody who's implicated in this crap and is sick of it. Anyway, yeah. But that narrative piece it's critical that we understand that the narrative dimension is not separate from actual warfare. It is actual warfare. Narrative is actual warfare.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's all this interest in narrative within all of the, nonprofit funded. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 100%. So, this part, I just wanted to note, outcomes again of this insurgency, maybe insurgent victory, a negotiated settlement, or a government victory, right? And so they kind of name like these three ideas of the way it can play out. But this part on the overview of counterinsurgency, I think, is just, it's great, right? So COIN, or counterinsurgency, is a blend of comprehensive civilian and military efforts designed to simultaneously defeat and contain insurgency and address its root causes. Some of the key objectives of COIN operations are to reduce violence, address core grievances, and enable the HN government, again, that means whole nation, but you could think of it as local government, right, or whatever, to exercise political control over its population, territory, via a system of legitimate governance. Therefore, COIN is fundamentally an armed political competition between a government and its partners and insurgents and their supporters. I mean, you can't get much more distilled than that. But I mean, and you could, again, I mean, we could talk about some of the work that goes on into violence prevention work, which is like a very tricky space, and then addressing core grievances. I mean, what's interesting to me in this manual is the idea that they want to address root causes, because I don't actually think that they want to address root causes, but they want to be able to speak to that and say that they are. What they mean by root causes and what we mean by is pretty much in diametric opposition.
Yeah, like your roots go a centimeter deep.
Yeah, and you could think about also like all the types of nonprofit and academic work that speak about root causes and cause analysis and all this stuff, but actually are not. There's no way for that to like operationalize or sort of do anything other than, diagnosing some certain problems and things like that.
Yeah, no, it's about an alienation from praxis, and by alienation from praxis, I don't mean a kind of sanitized notion of praxis. I mean praxis as a totality. Praxis as a totality that also includes, for example, things like an armed threat, right? Things like an incorrigible component of a particular stream of movement. And by incorrigible, it's not reducible to people that are involved in armed struggle or guerrilla warfare. It's people who might be just politically incorrigible. Like they're unwilling to accept a particular kind of concession, progressive concession from the state because they actually just reject the legitimacy of state power to begin with, right? Or government, right? Or that particular state institution, right? So, I mean, one of the examples that's come up that I'm learning from all the time, and I think is really beautiful, is the stuff happening in abolitionist social work, right? Victoria Copeland kind of hit me to this. Shout out to Victoria, but abolitionist social workers who are engaged in this work within an institution whose legitimacy of which they fundamentally reject, right? That is a carceral, anti-Black, colonial apparatus, meaning kind of the child and family policing apparatus, right? What people call child protective services or whatever it is, right? So there's a kind of emergent, incorrigible stream within people that are working under the auspices of that particular institution. I am really interested in cultivating an incorrigible stream of people employed by institutions like universities and colleges, who are employed by them, my hands being raised, but who are invested in a politics and a praxis that recognizes that these institutions are irreparable, that the way in which that they have been set up, as well as the way in which they are developing, actually requires their abolition. Right? And that's an emerging. Hopefully, I'm being optimistic here, and I'm not normally. I'm optimistic that this can actually be a robust debate among people who are involved with like universities and colleges, right? Because a lot of us, me included, for a long time have been invested in trying to transform shit within these universities, like which I'm still happy and willing to do various forms of kind of management and casualty management, right? Like kind of trying to make room for people just to survive the place. But in terms of a politics, I am not interested, for example, in trying to like run people to become deans. I don't think that the apparatus will change with a kick-ass dean, right? I might support you if you became my dean, Jared. You know what I'm saying? Like I'll do that. But say that the institution itself is like,
I don't think you.
Yeah, right. I actually don't think the institution should and I think we can do all the stuff that the institution says it does better without it. I'm talking about research, teaching, learning, preparing people to do things beyond the kind of the schooling context. Like, and I see it, right? I see it in various communities of pedagogy and learning. I would argue that even this very limited and humble form of study that you and I are doing this morning, right? I'm willing to bet that like, if I show this to a classroom of students in a university setting, they're likely to learn a lot more from the hour and a half that we're talking than they will from probably the vast majority of the stuff they're learning in their other classes. I'm willing to bet that.
I want to be humble, but I think you're right. So
yeah,
I agree.
So it's fun because it's also fucking fun.
It is fun, absolutely.
There's like a joy in the place. Like I love like peeking at the comments while we're talking on the YouTube and seeing what people are saying. You know what I mean? Like there's something about this that's different.
Absolutely.
It's because of the autonomy of it, right? And I'm saying like it's a modest and minor part of a larger totality of what I think can be an incorrigible stream of praxis that is unapologetically defending other incorrigible practices within that totality of praxis, right? Including potentially shit that involves extra legal challenges to the state, right? And that's where most folks don't want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about this mindset section. I think it's important too. So counterinsurgency is distinguished from traditional warfare due to the focus of its operations. Again, a relevant population, right? So it's
a relevant population.
Relevant.
What do they mean by relevant population? Who knows? Whatever they want it to mean.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, feel me on this. This is what the state of Israel, Netanyahu, and them, like, this is what they are in a fucked up and I think non-credible way literally doing these last several months. Right? It's like they're deciding on the fly what the relevant population is to be eliminated.
Yes.
And the thing is that what I think the Israeli strategy, and for that matter, the U.S. response, has forgotten is if you look at I think it's the Kilcullen text.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's that text. But what it outlines is how it is that a long historical, consistent tactic of insurgencies against, especially occupying colonial powers, is to intentionally provoke a deadly military overreaction, so-called an overreaction from the counterinsurgent forces, right? Meaning one in which the insurgents are kind of knowingly engaging in a tactic that will lead to a lot of suffering, but which will potentially, if not in all likelihood, discredit the occupying colonial power in kind of the global picture, in the local picture, but also in the global picture, that people will be, around the world as well as in that region, will begin to kind of differently understand and maybe more accurately and honestly recognize what that colonial occupation power actually is, right? Against its own, self-aggrandizing rhetoric of being a democracy and doing this and doing that. And so it's part of what is irregular, right? And of course, most folks don't want to deal with that, and much less do they want to defend it when an insurgency does that. But I think we're actually seeing this happen in real time, and not just in Gaza and Israel, but all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I think there's kind of there's like a Western liberal progressive academic social justice nonprofit sensibility that does not want anything to do with that calculus. Because it's
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've had definitely some conversations on here where we've talked about various aspects of that. I think one of the things I would say too is, like, in examining Israel through the lens of this document, you have a number of challenges. One being that I don't think that their manual for counterinsurgency would look like this. But I would say that the other aspect of it is that if you look at the most successful aspects of Israeli counterinsurgency, it is probably Oslo and, what has happened with the West Bank, and so, this, what we're seeing right now is actually very ineffective from a counterinsurgency standpoint. Although at this point, it's more like a genocidal,
that's exactly the point. No, that's exactly. So you actually did it in a much more concise way than me. But that's exactly the point. Is that something? A tactic was undertaken that then pushed the occupying force into measures which far exceed the framework of counterinsurgency that we're talking about here, right? Into actual just genocidal war, extermination. It's like an extermination process.
Yeah. And again, Kilcullen, like, one of the fascinating things in Kilcullen I found is, like, early on, he's talking about the Nazis through a counterinsurgency lens. And I thought, this is nuts. Yes. I was like, but it gives you an example of how, like, that even in this scope, in this realm of counterinsurgency, that obviously most of it comes out of colonialism and settler colonialism, because it's all about how do we manage these populations that recognize that we're outsiders and we're trying to legitimate a power structure, a control structure that is in our interest. And but absolutely. So let me see, let's scoot ahead a little bit. Another interesting thing here too, which would, I think, bring in some interesting conversations around abolition movements and around a lot of social movements, is the primacy that they place on population security and on security in general as an aspect of this. Kilcullen does this as well, and talking about, like, for instance, in his book about how like low levels of violence in a neighborhood don't necessarily mean that the neighborhood is under your control. It may mean that it's under the insurgents' control, and that they just do a better job than the host government does in providing security and such through within the neighborhood and stuff like that. And I think that's a really interesting discussion, because I think sometimes within abolition organizing, it gets so oppositional, or thinking just about the police, but not thinking then about how are you going to address, like, how are you going to legitimize yourself within the population that you seek to work with, and how are you going to take care of real stuff that goes on within the neighborhood to keep the forces you're trying to delegitimate out of the picture. And obviously for abolitionists, I think that's the goal, right? You don't want people to have to call the police for everything, because you recognize the police are a violent, occupational force. But that also means that you have to be able to fill in some of those functions, if you, and to hopefully a much better way. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. And like, let me just preface it by saying that, at the same time that I think that my commitments are pretty consistently, what I and hopefully others call abolitionist. I'm actually not even at this point that certain anymore what folks mean when they say abolitionist.
For sure.
So I've kind of like taken a hiatus from introducing myself to, oh yeah, I'm an abolitionist. Like, cause that shit could mean a lot of stuff, which 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, a lot of my comrades say, no, that shit is not, that's anti-abolitionist. But like, there's folks who, who are practicing and who have historically adhered to really a counter and undermining, a politics that's counter and undermining of abolitionism, that are now overtly and stridently calling what they do abolitionists, right? So like, I'm saying that's why there's a hiatus. So
I get it.
Yeah. But the thing that you're pointing at, which is, this kind of, this mandate to create forms of security and fulfillment of needs, addressing, kind of the asymmetric vulnerabilities that for example, criminalized populations and peoples confront on a daily basis, right? There's another layer to this problem, which is that I think that there needs to be a more intensive debate among serious and committed abolitionists about whether the forms of security, food security, housing security, personal security, community security that they're interested in, will either depend on a negotiation or expropriation of the state and state power, or the creation of state-like apparatuses. I think that needs to be a more serious and intensive discussion. And I say that because I think a common mistake that many of us make, including me, is that we fail to account for all of the forms of security that folks provide for each other already under conditions of extreme duress, right? I'm talking about and I've learned this from a loved one named Tashiri Harrison, right? That was in Pelican Bay for a long time. Like, I learned from him especially, and from others. Yogi Pinnell was in Pelican Bay for a long time. My good dear close friend Mike No, who was locked up in San Quentin for a long time, and he's in the so-called free world, the non-incarcerated world now. Something I learned from them is examples of all these forms of caretaking and security that were unfolding within those particular sites of extreme subjection and vulnerability state violence, which were not just autonomous of the power and apparatus of the state, but were fucking against it. They were illegal, right? They were actually against, they were doing stuff that the state would call contraband, like to help each other, to keep each other alive. I'm not going to talk about it here, but I'm saying,
yeah.
So there's that. And then there's other practices that, queer trans sex work communities in places like San Francisco and elsewhere. I've learned a shitload from people who are part of those communities and people who engage with and think about and collaborate with those communities, right? Talking about how those communities are subjected to very specific forms of vulnerability policing, state and extra state violence. and the forms of caretaking and security making that communities like that undertake is fucking profound. It's fucking profound, and it's historic. It's not some shit that just pops off. It's like it's an ongoing organic practice that comes from those geographies and those positions. And we could go on and on, right? But my point is that if we're having if we're trying to think through a counter to the way that the counterinsurgency apparatus is trying to like fabricate notions of security for vulnerable populations, then actually what it means is that you need to localize and be intimate with the understanding of how security creation might already actually be happening in these places, right? And it might be happening in ways that are contradictory, that, you know, they're not entirely flawless, right? But nonetheless, they're demonstrating how it is that there might be more effective forms of creating housing, food, recreational, you know, et cetera, security in those sites than the state could ever provide, or that a state like abolitionist infrastructure could ever provide. So like, there's a kind of humility that I think needs to be embraced here, a practical humility, you know, meaning that you might not have to fucking answer, right?
Right.
In fact, the people that are in these sites might actually be trying to figure out those answers because they have to, right? And these things are happening autonomous, not just autonomous of the state, but now they're talking about autonomous of movements, autonomous of the nonprofit and, you know, civil society apparatus, autonomous of even like the imaginaries that I think a lot of social justice activists want to impose on vulnerable communities. You know, and just quick shout out to one of my favorite reference points is Ujima Medics, right? What Amika Tendahi Martin Cavarol did and are doing in Southside Chicago. It's like, again, it's a small example, but it's a really critical example for me about how they have created an apparatus that has addressed a kind of asymmetric domestic war making and entirely, I think, programmed and intentional so-called state negligence around caring for the lives, like the actual life and breath of Black people in Southside Chicago, by way of creating like an emergency response apparatus among the people where they're training people from age 5 to age 95 to deal with, you know, potentially fatal asthma attacks and gunshot wounds that should not lead to death, right? But if you left it to the state, if you left it to the medical apparatus, if you left it to the nonprofit industrial complex, they're not interested, and they're also like intentionally not capable of responding to those forms of vulnerability. So I'm saying like this is part of the kind of abolitionist dilemma that I think again, it requires more serious situated analysis, and it also means that you might have to step back from thinking about state power and state-like power, right? In meaning infrastructure, right? State infrastructure and state-like infrastructure. It might mean something different than that.
Right on. Yeah, and I mean, not to contradict what you just said, but I also think that, like, if you look at, you know, Hamas, Hezbollah, Ansar Allah, like all of these examples of so-called insurgents that the government is targeting right now, that they're all are different forms. I mean, even the Taliban, right, which they talk about in these things, like there were, you know, whatever people think about them or their politics or their religion and all of that, they filled in huge gaps in state capacity and infrastructure that was a part of how they gained their legitimacy. And so I'm not saying that you use that as your example or anything like that, but I'm just saying, like, understand that is part of the equation for sure.
Yeah. Well, no, exactly. No, that's exact. No, I feel like you're just kind of, to me, you're actually elaborating and adding to the importance of this point, which is that if people who are on the side of, you know, radical liberationist and anti-colonial and decolonizing, you know, futurities, imagination, right? If we're going to be serious about that, then we need to be much more rigorous and serious and precise and, like I said, intimate and localized and humble about finding ways to fill those sites of insecurity in ways that will prevent reactionaries from fulfilling it. right? I mean, this is why like I think more of us need to be fucking preppers. Like for real. Like, I mean, the prepper communities, I know it's a diverse community, but like, I feel like there's way too much of the prepper community. I mean, I'm talking about people who are like getting shit ready for the inevitable collapse of the state and economic infrastructure, including power grids, you know, food supply, all that shit, right? Water, you know. I'm saying there's way too many, you know, strains within this the kind of prepper community that are fucking reactionaries, or they're like right-wing libertarians, right? And there's far too few that are folks that are in like whatever you want to call this generalized community of kind of interested social justice people. Now we all start with each other, but like there's not enough people from that general blob of like left-oriented, aspirationally left-oriented people that are interested in doing that shit. And I think it's because there's a kind of loyalty and kind of a loyalty of imagination, a loyalty of futurity, a loyalty of practice to notions of infrastructure and notions of institutionality that are either actually the state or resemble the state. And like, this is a problem. This is a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
This is how we feed into the political logic of counterinsurgency, whether or not we've ever read this fucking manual.
Yeah. So I wanted to point to this section: disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. This was
DDR. You got an acronym for it. DDR.
Yeah, DDR. This is really interesting because it's a process of standing down parties to an armed conflict and their reintegration of ex-combatants into civilian life. It seeks to address the post-conflict security challenge that arises from ex-combatants being left without livelihoods or support networks during such critical transitional periods. Man, I read this and the first thing that comes to my mind is reentry.
Yeah.
You know, it comes to mind of like, and why, again, an aspect that, and I shout out to all the people who do radical, you know, meaningful or try to, you know, work within reentry spaces. Like I know there's shout out to like Focus that's connected with IDOC Watch in Indiana and stuff like that. But NTL House Lawyer Speak has tried to create some apparatuses like this as well. I think that it's critical to understand that, you know, people, I mean, you're coming back from prison, you're coming home from a combat situation and being, you know, reintegrating into civilian life. And it makes so much sense to me why also the nonprofit industrial complex is so involved in this sphere. And, you know, they obviously it's, you know, I understand it's not a one-to-one comparison or anything like that, but it definitely resonates with me. And the idea that obviously I want people who come home to be welcomed, to be safe, to be able to find employment and ways for them to meet their needs and all those we want all those kind of things for folks. But that idea of integrating them into the, you know, kind of the legitimacy of the state, you know, in a certain way, integrating them into the counterinsurgency is the thing that I'm really wary of and thinking about within a lot of reentry work. Anyway.
No, I can relate something to this, which is shout out to the Underground Scholars Initiative, which has popped off in University of California in the last several years. In special shout out to the UC Riverside chapter, which I'm proud to serve as whatever the faculty person that works with Underground Scholars Initiative or the Underground Scholars chapter. Underground Scholars is in some ways a project that it's basically a reentry project that's constantly struggling to navigate the problems that you've just named. And I'll say that, you know, I was in direct conversation with the folks who founded the chapter at Rivers, and this is probably goes back 8 years or so now at this point, actually maybe longer. And one of the things that we very consistently talked about then and continue to talk about now are some of the challenges and problems that come with the institutionalization of that particular type of reentry apparatus, which is, and I'm going to go back to narrative now, right? It's not only the kind of institutional reintegration into civil society institutions that pushes people away from like the fronts of potential insurgency and domesticates and civilizes them, right? I use those facetiously, but also meaningfully. But it's also an ongoing narrative counterinsurgency. So something I've talked about with Underground Scholars. Oh, sorry, Underground Scholars is it's a program that brings formerly incarcerated and system affected people into the university as students, right? Like that's the whole point. Like one of the ways it gets phrased, which I don't necessarily like the way this is phrased, but one of the ways it gets phrased is that it's like instead of a school to prison pipeline, it's a prison to university pipeline. So I don't really like that, but I know that that's one of the ways it gets talked about. But knowing the fact that the University of California Regents, which is a wretched group of people, in fact, right before we talked today, I was just like in the live stream listening to people righteously articulate how they're on the genocidal side of history right at this moment. They always are, but like in this moment in particular. But knowing that the UC Regents funded this, right? They funded the Underground Scholars Initiative, right? And it was a pittance. It was a relative pittance, but nonetheless, it's because they wanted to seize the narrative, right? The UC administration, the University of California apparatus, they wanted to seize the Underground Scholars narrative. And this is what we've talked about over the years among actual underground scholars, is how part of what the university wants to do is it wants to steal their fucking stories, right? Always. It wants to steal it wants to hijack their stories. It wants to commodify and extract from their particular narratives of striving and vulnerability and suffering. And it wants to turn them into other kinds of things, at bare minimum, a kind of DEI opportunity, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion opportunity. But sometimes more cynically, it actually turns into a criminalization of people who don't fit within a particular kind of reentry narrative, right? And so that's the other side of the passage you just read from the manual, is that on the other side of the DDR thing, right? This attempt to reintegrate, there's always going to be insurgents and so-called former insurgents who either cannot or do not or refuse to fit within that reentry narrative, right? That reintegration narrative. So it's a narrative problem. And here's the problem also that I wanted to emphasize is that in many cases, especially in North American and U.S. social justice circles and networks, social justice people, social justice workers and leaders and thinkers and participants buy into the reintegration narrative. I think that there's way too often a relatively uncritical, if not opportunistic and kind of vulgarly pragmatist embrace of these reentry and reintegration and civilizing narratives that directly feeds the criminalization and policing of people who, again, are unwilling, incapable, or who refuse to participate and to allow themselves to be pulled into those narratives.
Right on. And folks had asked about the kill colon, so I put a link to that in the chat. But I would just caution folks with any of these documents, you are going to have to read against them because they're horrible.
Yeah.
But they're hard to understand and study.
Read them, and then study them collectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. You and I are trying to do that exercise right here. But that's the whole point of doing this, right? Is that these things are archival statements, and we need, put it this way: these folks like Petraeus and Mattis and like all the folks that are under them, they are literally studying our literatures, right? Like both the ones that we write and engage in and like perform like we are right now, but also I'm talking about like the classic, anti-colonial, revolutionary, Marxist, anarchist, it's Black liberationists, like those motherfuckers study that shit probably way more rigorously consistently than folks in our different circles and networks are studying state documents and state literatures.
Yeah. Right. Oh, I mean, even as you read the counterinsurgency stuff and you get into Kill Cullen, one of the things that stood out to me is how much it sounds like good communist practice almost. Yeah. Like it sounds like dialectical, like they're doing like dialectical materialism, right? They're like, but like they're really, and I say that because they're attuned to material conditions. They're attuned to like, what does the population think about what's going on? They're attuned to changing conditions. They're studying, they're archiving what they're studying, they're sharing it, they're developing it, right? And so like, it is obviously the polar inverse of what, like Marx or Lenin or anybody else thought people should be doing, or Cabral, but like it's attuned to the same things, right? And so and it's rigorous, like you said. So anyway, I'll just say that. All right, so I'm gonna zoom through the kind of last section of this and let the audience ask some questions because I think we've covered a lot. Okay. this part was interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think is important is we've kind of talked about it, but they talk about joint force, civilian agencies, multinational partners, separate entities within the counterintelligence force will likely analyze problems differently, leading to uncoordinated attempts at solutions that may undermine, if not conflict with one another. So this is the purpose of a common operational procedure or picture, which we might think of as task forces, right? Which is something that we see all the time in response to different, different disruptions, right? At a university level, at a local government level, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
They talk about planning again, like they have all these considerations, right? Negotiation, mediation, security cooperation, counter-guerrilla operations, this is an interesting thing too. I mean, Kilcullen talks quite a bit about how within counterinsurgency, killing your opponent is actually not necessarily a good idea a lot of the time.
Right.
Because you want to isolate them and make people come to your side. And again, this is why we could talk about how Gaza, might be a really poor example of counterinsurgency, but an example of genocide, because they're saying, no, we're just going to kill a lot of people and then try to use that tactic to turn them against the insurgents, rather than, where they talk about how if you kill an insurgent, Kilcullen talks about this, then it's very likely that actually supports the insurgency because, people, are connected to them. You may create more militants, etc. This is another thing I wanted to reference to that's very important to this is stability activities. And I see this in a lot of your work, Dylan, of thinking about, counterinsurgency and, the ways that, it also, I think, explains some of, for instance, if we wanted to talk about the co-optation of abolition and all those different things that you alluded to earlier, I see those as attempts to stabilize, of saying, okay, we're going to incorporate some of this, defang it, make it more liberal, and make it fit within our world. And that way we diffuse this narrative and kind of stabilize things.
Right. And let me add to this. Let me add to this point. Part of, and this I think gets under theorized, part of the thing that the counterinsurgency apparatus considers to be what it calls stability. What it's really talking about is a stability that is a condition. It's a condition that lends itself to the invigoration or the re-legitimation of violent occupying power, right? For shorthand, let's just call it state power, right? If we translate this to something like the U.S. domestic warfare context, right? The U.S. kind of asymmetric domestic warfare context. Part of what that stability actually looks like, it actually might look like in a conflict-ridden context, right? So let's think about the way the counterinsurgency political logics that permeate the nonprofit industrial apparatus work. That can look a lot like conflict and instability in this sense. Let me pick on a particular way that I think this has been happening in the 21st century, which is that you have a nonprofit industrial complex. You have numerous types of social justice oriented organizations and people within nonprofit circles and organizations, including and I'll include the universities in this. So it's nonprofit university apparatuses. Then what happens is, we have a critique of it, right? So there's a critique of the limitations and the liberalism and the counterinsurgent political logics within the nonprofit industrial complex and the university and college and academic industrial complex. And then there's another layer that takes place where you have sometimes kind of relatively individualized, really, I'm just going to call them opportunists, right? And usually it's people who inhabit particular identity positions, right? And they're identity positions that get enunciated as positions that inhabit kind of structural positions of oppression, of vulnerability, et cetera, right? It doesn't think about whatever positions you like, right? But so it's not identity. I don't want to use the term identity politics, right? I want to talk about a kind of an exploitation, a mobilization of identity positions that these individualized, really entrepreneurs and opportunists then mobilize for clout, for resources, for credibility, by way of staging critiques of these civil society-based institutions, nonprofits, nonprofit organizations, universities, et cetera. And what they're actually doing is they're accumulating credibility and resources for themselves, right? So there's like this whole other layer of what looks like conflict, but which is actually kind of feeding to this totality of petty and sometimes ridiculous activities and arguments that are ultimately reproducing the state of legitimacy for an occupying and violent state, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So there's like complex layers of the way counterinsurgency political logics are working.
Yeah. And just due to time, we're not going to get too much further. If folks have questions, drop them in the chat. But I do want to bring up one other thing. I mean, I took down the first document, but one point that I left up on the screen as you were talking a little bit there is that they say political reform should be entered into as soon as possible, right? And so I think this is also a key thing as we think about when you have, an insurgent, when you have a movement that's going on, the counterinsurgency experts understand that the most effective thing to diffuse that movement is a reform. And I think that should actually be something that we are always constantly wary of, is what are they going to hand out to kind of try to make this just go away, right? And but I wanted to bring something else up. So this is taken from Ill Will. Folks may know that website, but it's actually a chapter from a book that I love by Shama Yu, who's this French philosopher. Called The Ungovernable Society, A Genealogy of Authoritarian Liberalism. Who Black from Black Mist podcast, and Nijli was the person who shared this with me. But it is a great chapter, and folks can check it out. It's on their website. But what it breaks down is the entrance of counterinsurgency experts in, especially the early 80s, into the corporate world. And the one that they use as an example is Nestle. And I'm old enough to remember this. I know some of you are not. But Nestle, there was a pamphlet that was created that was called The Baby Killer, that was by activists, right, who had identified that Nestle was killing mothers and children in Africa and South America with its formula, that it wasn't teaching them how to use it. It was improper, techniques. They weren't being trained properly on how to use it. Didn't have the means, I think, to boil the water or whatever it was that was necessary to make it not toxic, right? And so there was a huge campaign, an international boycott that was called against them. And they were totally taken off guard and didn't know how to deal with it. And they brought in, Raphael Pagan, a man of the hard right and a former military intelligence officer. He had been an advisor to Kennedy and Johnson in the late 70s, became a business advisor. He joined Nestle in 1981 to set up a task force to fight the activists for every inch of ground. Anyways, it's really interesting. It talks about exactly what you just talked about in terms of opportunists. So they break insurgent groups into these four components: the radicals, the opportunists, the idealists, the realists. And they talk about the way that radicals they won't deal with, because they recognize, again, like the insurgents, that you're not going to change these folks. But there's all these other folks who are involved in movements that can be co-opted or, attacked in different ways. And I think it's really useful piece just to kind of think about this in relation to a domestic context, think about it in relation to like corporate world, because it's thoroughly embedded in there too, and has been for a long time.
Can I share my screen and talk real quick about a couple other examples, Jared? I can just do that, right? By clicking.
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So let me do this.
If it's the stuff you sent me, I have it too. I can do that.
Oh no, this is different. Okay, no, here we go. Here I got it.
All right.
There we go. So check this out. Okay, here's more examples that build on the one you just gave. So on the left, this is the narrative counterinsurgency that we were talking about earlier. So let me explain. So the bottom, it's at the bottom left there. It says from gang life to doctoral student, right? So this is what I'm talking about, right? So the institution, University of California, Riverside, like their development office, meaning their fundraising office, the one that tries to raise money for the university and all that shit. Like they're trying to raise money. And this is an envelope that went out to a bunch of potential funders and contributors and alumni and whatnot. And they were, literally trying to capitalize on the narratives of the underground scholars, the formerly incarcerated people. Right. So there's one. And then here's another one. Sorry, let me try this one too, Jared.
Yeah. You should be able to just add a tab. You're like sharing your whole screen, which is fine. But
Okay, my bad. So okay, here. This one. Can you see that?
Go to, hang on just a sec. So go to present again.
Okay.
Click stop screen.
Okay.
No, it's fine. And then click it and click share screen again. But then it'll say you have an option. I think select a tab,
right,
and that'll work better.
That's right. Here we go. This one. I want y'all to see this one too. Here's another example. Right. I could not leave the show today without providing this example because I'm actually working on an article and a chapter around this. I'm trying to kind of demystify this. So the rise of the Stop Asian Hate movement, including organizations like the Asian American Foundation, which quickly became a multi-billion-dollar foundation, and even kind of national research efforts like Stop AAPI Hate, they are directly tied to like long-running established nonprofit, civil society political organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, an openly Zionist, pro-Israel propagandizing organization, right? This guy, Jonathan Greenblatt, like he's on the board of the Asian American Foundation. So I'm saying the way that this counterinsurgency is working, it's also, there's these institutional and organizational implications that happen across practices that are not readily obvious or available to casual or even like everyday observers, right? So I'm saying that the layers through which the politics and political logics of counterinsurgency are happening, they're significantly happening in an extra state form, right? They're exceeding the authority and the overview of the state because when the military publishes the manual, it's actually learning from the shit that the nonprofit industrial complex and universities and academic industrial complex have been doing for a while now, right? Which is precisely why when the military revised and rewrote the counterinsurgency field menu, they pulled those people in to the conversation, right? As direct consultants and basically kind of, silent co-authors for entire sections of the counterinsurgency field manual.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pull up a couple of quick questions for us before we have to get out of here. I'm sorry, y'all. Dylan, it's actually me this time. Dylan would have stayed for forever with y'all, but so this one was, what ways would you say, coin pacification is productive, as in not just repressive? How can we go against that?
Okay, quick. I'll give a quick response to this. So we oftentimes emphasize and rightfully obsess over how counterinsurgency demobilizes radicalism, right? It demobilizes stuff that is autonomous and aggressively and incorrigibly opposing state power, et cetera, right? So demobilization is, or what you're calling repression in the question, that is an important and central feature of counterinsurgency. What I want to argue that we need to pay equal attention to is mobilization, meaning that the shit that Jared was just talking about, what counterinsurgency simultaneously does as it demobilizes people away from insurgent radical activities is it mobilizes them toward liberalism, basically, right? It mobilizes them toward forms of activity that are contributing to restoring and vindicating the legitimacy of the kind of occupying power or the state or the police or whatever it might be. So I'd say, like, in a nutshell, it's always productive. It's just that I think the analysis and the response and the experience of counterinsurgency doesn't always frame things in the terms of mobilization because we're so fucked up about how we've been demobilized, right? So think about the shit that you've been mobilized into, all the bullshit that you are mobilized into, especially task forces, right? The main response of so many institutions to the rebellions of 2020 were task forces, corporate task forces, community task forces, city council task forces, university task forces, K through 12 school task forces every fucking where. That was a mobilization.
I got pulled into that shit. Yeah.
That was a counterinsurgency mobilization. That was a counterinsurgency mobilization that was demobilizing on the one hand and pulling a lot of us into bullshit on the other. So it's always both those things. I think that importance of that question is it foregrounds that analysis. Thank you for that question. That's really important.
Yep. So I just bring this back up. This was an earlier question. I would just say, that actually effective counterinsurgency is actually interested in most in restoring the legitimacy of the existing. I mean, from a military perspective, they're quite clear that what they want is U.S. hegemony. They're like, or Western hegemony. They're like, we want the home nation to be favorable to the U.S. government, essentially, and we want that to be a legitimate institution because it's good for us, essentially. But I think that so it's really focused around this idea of legitimacy, whereas I think genocide, you know, is obviously it's horrendous. It doesn't long term tend to promote the legitimacy of the institution that's enacting the genocide, for a variety of reasons, but not least of which is that, people don't like mass death, and I think that, yeah.
Well, and the thing, first of all, shout out to my friend Maria Firmino Castillo, my friend and comrade and co-worker, importantly. I think it's a dynamic relationship would also the way I would respond to this, because on the one hand, what we need to take seriously are kind of like the temporalities and modalities through which genocide unfolds. So one of the, I think, most important responses, for example, to the current moment, arguably current conjuncture, is that Israeli conducted genocide against the Palestinian people did not begin on October 7th or November 7th, 2023, right? It did not, that's not when it started. That there was already an unfolding, and this is Palestinians have been saying this for decades, that there was already an unfolding form of, many folks have called it slow death. And other folks have actually used terms either directly referencing or parallel to the terms of genocide to reference what the occupation has been doing in a kind of protracted form. So one could say that what counterinsurgency intends is to provide cover for a particular temporality and modality through which genocide happens in a normalized way, right? And that's why the terms of denormalizing shit is so critical also.
Right on. And yeah, I mean, I should have even thought about that, because your book actually touches all upon that very tension, because you're dealing with the logics of genocide built into U.S., settler, colonial, imperial project. Yeah. And also, I agree. It's about, within counterinsurgency, you don't want what's going on currently, because it's happening. It's too much death in such a tight period of time, and it's sending up alarm bells around the world, basically.
Right on. Yeah.
Shout out, of course, always to Orasami Burton. Yes, he absolutely talks about this, especially the second half of his book. He deals a lot with reformist counterinsurgency in the wake of the Attica Rebellion. So absolutely true.
Ori, Sharice, Stelly, shout out to both of you. Yeah. Love you both. Yep. And your books just popped off, and they inform a lot of what I had to say and think about today.
Yeah, always inform a lot of what I have to say. Dindy, shout out to Dindy. So this was an earlier question about, like, when part of this time when we were talking about these differences, these real differences, right, between maybe an anarchist trajectory, a state socialist trajectory, a social democratic trajectory, etc. That how do we deal with these in a time of rising fascism? And knowing Dindy, she doesn't just mean rising fascism in the form of like the Republican Party, although that's obviously a part of it, but also, what we would call, genocide is rising fascism as well, right? And so what's going on under the current administration as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think what's key is that we have to have a more dynamic understanding of what fascism actually is. I think one of the points of reference for this, of course, is George Jackson's Blood My Eye, which I'm thankful is I think it's been kind of resurging. Like, I think the readership and study of Blood My Eye has been resurging in recent years. But I think the point of understanding fascism in a particular way is that if we understand fascism as something which exceeds the classical definitions, which are very deeply white supremacist and Eurocentric, and which understands both the liberal political form and the neoliberal racial capitalist form as already fascistic, precisely in its asymmetrical, its infliction of asymmetrical casualties on specific targeted populations, right? That fascism's already here. That's what George Jackson famously said. Fascism's already here. Like, he's writing this and saying, like, I'm watching it unfold in real time. We need to identify and call it that. And just because white America doesn't experience it that way does not mean that it's not already here. And in fact, that is the face fascism takes. Right. So the way counterinsurgency works is to provide cover for all of that by constantly opening up these forms of liberalism, of reform, of progress, and also, like I talked about earlier, of kind of accommodation and participation in apparatuses in state and state-like processes, including task forces, including negotiations, including universities, and city council procedures that accommodate folks into something which feeds the cover, right? So I think using the terms of fascism is important, but I think it's as important to elaborate what we mean when we say that, and to say that it's not equivalent to Donald Trump, right? It is as equivalent to Biden, to Obama, to Clinton, as it is to Bush, Trump, in their company.
100%. Unfortunately, folks, I have to go. I have to pick up my son from school. But I very much appreciate this, Dylan. I hope that we can do it again soon.
I love you. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, I love you too, man. And folks, just to remind folks, we are going to do a study group. And maybe we'll be able to cajole Dylan into coming to a session or something.
I'd love it.
Yeah, well, that would be awesome. And so there is a link to that in the show description. You can also find it on our social media, on Instagram and Twitter and all of that. And of course, at our Patreon. And so, yeah, thanks a lot, Dylan. This has been wonderful. Very much appreciate it. And,
really, it's a privilege. I appreciate everybody who came through and who's gonna listen, watch. I mean, appreciate it. I'm in for the study group.
Awesome. That's great. All right, I'm going to take us out of here. Thanks again, Dylan.
Peace. All right, talk to y'all soon.